because this is the after lunch session, what we're going to do is just have a brief introduction, and I'll explain our kind of workshop around the tables, or more specifically, you're going to break up into your teams. And if you're here on your own, we're going to put you in a special group. But what we want to do now is this morning we identified the fact that we have some shortcomings, weaknesses, gaps in our moving to the right. And often those come in the area of evangelism in the 4 E's. Tony helped us to think that, of course we think we need to pray more, we need to train and mobilize more people to do the work, and we need to have patience. We also need to clarify the message we are proclaiming that, as Tony said, pulls people towards maturity, to the right. And so what we're going to do now is actually to see how that clarity around the gospel actually influences not just the evangelism quadrant, but also influences actually all 4. And we're going to talk around our tables about areas that you think that you can improve upon and do what we would say is both some evaluation and innovation. That's what we're going to do at our tables and our teams. We're going to evaluate our current ministry culture and maybe think and brainstorm together of some ways to innovate to help fill the gaps with what we've learned, okay? But before we get into that, I just want to explain a few things about this little grid. Of course, we have the left to right aspect of engage, evangelize, establish, equip. But another helpful overlay is actually to build it upwards, to think about the 3 main spheres or areas where these things happen. Okay, we know that we can engage at the bottom sphere on the individual level. You can do personal engagement, and that happens all over in neighborhoods, at workplaces, and the like. We can also go one level up and say there's all sorts of small pockets or groups that meet in your church or through your church. So think small groups, Sunday school classes, women's and men's ministries. Anything that happens in a subgroup of your whole church would be considered a small group. And then at the top sphere, the top layer up, is the Sunday morning gathering, the main gathering of your people, most likely, not always, but most likely on Sunday morning. So we have individual, small, and small group, and then large group Sunday morning. So if you have those questions in front of you, and I think we have enough, you at least share with someone next to you, but we should have enough at each table so you can see them. Understanding this grid will help you understand the kind of questions that you're going to go through at your table. Okay, so these questions are going to talk about, and I'll walk through each one of them so you understand what we mean by them, and then I'll give some specific instructions, and we'll take some time to talk about it. Questions for discussion about the ministry you're currently active in. Again, whether that's your church or campus ministry or youth group, wherever you think your ministry is, this is what we want you to think about. So question number 1, in the last year, think about and see if you can come up with a good estimate of how many people you've moved from engage to evangelize. How many people you've told the gospel to, you've proclaimed the gospel of God's judgment and salvation from judgment. That you've proclaimed Jesus' death and resurrection, that you've proclaimed repentance and faith. All right? Because this is back to what we were saying this morning, where often the engage box gets really wide, or we just move people from engage into establish. And that's what happens a lot. Okay? So we want you to think through, see if you can come up with a number, how many people you've moved from engage to evangelize. Okay? Is that clear? Good on that one. Number 2, how and where does evangelism happen in your ministry? Now this one is specifically looking at the vertical evangelize. So if you go from the evangelize box and you go straight up, where does evangelism happen individually? You can think like, okay, I know these families who try to get people in their neighborhood together for a dinner and talk about Jesus. Or small groups. Are there, like, the classic one would be, do you run a Christianity Explored or Alpha course? Or what do you do for evangelism in small groups in and through your church? And then at the top level, when and how does evangelism happen on your Sunday morning flagship gathering? Does it happen through the preaching? How much does it happen through the preaching? Are there other avenues it happens through the preaching or through the Sunday morning service? So where and how does evangelism happen? Okay? Number 3, when someone is new from your church or as a new Christian, when someone comes to your church who's new, how do you establish that person in the specific content of the gospel? I was talking to a friend of mine at the break, and he was saying that one of the implications already from this day is that he's going to train his small group leaders in the gospel. And my question to you, in your church structures, when someone is a Christian and they're being established, when and how, where does it happen they actually learn the content of the gospel? Number 4, how would the people you minister to summarize the driving motivation for them to pursue godliness and Christ-likeness? How and where is this taught? This is more kind of a feel. Like if you ask or interviewed 20 people in your ministry context, and you said, similar to what we did this morning, in a nutshell, in one sentence, or in a short paragraph or short description, why is it that we should pursue Christ-likeness? What would they say? Right, would they say? And then maybe talk about how this is actually taught in your church structures. You can talk about it in relation to the context. Okay, we have a small group that does X, or we do this on Sunday mornings, or we deploy people to meet one-to-one individually, and they go through Y. So just talk about how this happens and where it happens. Sorry. And then number 5, how many people in the last year have made noticeable steps to the right such that they are actively ministering back to the left? What trellises, program structures help them do this? All right. So this is the observation that you are maturing people and growing their love for Christ and therefore love for the others, that they are actually moving back to the left, that you've heard stories about. So maybe share those stories. But also specifically, what are your trellises to point people back to the left? Do you have any? And if not, is that intentional? And if it is intentional, why don't you have any? So any discussion around that, okay? Is there any question on here you're not clear on or want more details on how to discuss? Good? All right, so what I'd like you to do now, I know some of the teams are spread out. If you can find those members of your church team, if you can figure out how to be all together at one table. I know this is going to take a little bit of reshuffling. If you're here by yourself, you can come up here to my left, and maybe a few of you guys can talk cross-church platform, so to speak, okay? Or you can just jump in with another church. But I think maybe we just, for clarity's sake, if you're here by yourself with no other person on your team, come up here to your left, and we'll see if we can put you in with another group, okay? And it's 1:10 now. Why don't we spend a half hour discussing that. So we're going to discuss this for about a half hour, reconvene, and talk in a bigger group about these questions, okay? Okay, why don't we now, you've had some time to talk amongst your team, and we're going to talk across the tables now to get some ideas from each other's churches. This is just really, the first question is really just to hear from you how much proclamation of judgment and salvation from God's judgment, repentance, sin, those things, how much is that happening in your ministry? How many people have you moved from engage to evangelize that you know, obviously? Anybody want to just talk about what you talked about with your team? None over here. The Parkside group has none. -4. You moved to the left. The Parkside crowd, they're moved to the left. Sorry. Aren't you glad you're back there? All right. Anybody want to just give us a brief of what you discussed around question number 1? Yeah, Mark.
One of the things we said was, in terms of, we have people in our congregation who engage and then perhaps invite somebody who just had Easter, so we preach the gospel at an Easter service or a Christmas service. So we definitely explain the gospel to people, but we have no idea how much that's going on the ground, or the individual or small group level.
So if your sermons are gospel-oriented, we do know that people are being gospeled, whether it's on Easter or every Sunday or somewhere in between. Hopefully it's every Sunday.
People's friends only come on Easter, that's it.
Okay, that's only one day a year they come on Easter. Not Christmas? Christmas Eve?
Not necessarily.
How many even here would say that you're part of your church that Christmas Eve and or Easter is your biggest outreach, Sunday morning outreach, or big gathering outreach? Do you have any other outreaches that go?
I wish it wasn't true, but yeah.
That's your biggest? What would be bigger? Yeah, Dan.
I think it's safe to say that the gospel is clearly proclaimed more consistently on Sunday. Probably not quite as consistently, but often in small groups. But the less formal, the more personal it gets, not that much, even in my personal life.
It's interesting. Tony, why don't you pick up on this on your PhD work on one another's speech? The idea, in one sense, it's not the reverse should be true, but there is a sense, what Dan's saying, it's the gospel is very clearly preached from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. We get some of it in small groups, and personally, it's not very clear. And that's actually interesting what you've been doing in your one another speech stuff, that the personal realm is really important because you can specify and be specific to this.
Yeah, evangelism happens very helpfully, and you've got to excuse me. You can tell why God directed me eventually into being a writer for most of my life rather than a speaker. Like one talk and my voice is gone. So I apologise for that. But evangelism does happen at all these different levels, and so does establishment, obviously, and all the other things. But it's really very common for us to give different emphasis to different parts of that. In the different aspects of the ministry. So it's actually really common in many churches to think that evangelism mainly happens either in the large gathering when we all get together and we preach the gospel in a sermon, so that you'd think our sermons will regularly have an evangelistic challenge as part of them. We'll address the non-Christians in the room. We'll specifically talk about the gospel. We'll call on people to respond and come and talk to me and do something. We'll actually do it there, and we'll think of it as an individual thing. So we'll send people out to witness as individuals, to witness to their friends and their workmates, and we might do something there. But it's interesting how this centre area is often also very weak in many churches. Explicit evangelistic group stuff that works. And we'll talk more about that, I guess, as we go along.
Okay. Actually, we'll just go into question number 2 because we've already folded into it a bit. How and where does evangelism happen in your ministry? If you look up, and Tony's already kind of talked through that.
Yeah,
But anybody else have any conversation about where evangelism happens? I think we can posit that evangelism happens on Sunday mornings when you preach the gospel in and through your sermons. Anywhere else? Yeah.
Not through small groups, and even just part of our engagement in church planting is people didn't want to come. So yeah.
So you're saying that the engage happens in a smaller group, which is like people coming together around food, and then the evangelism actually happens maybe on the individual level and follow-up conversations? Is that?
But I would say it's much more of a team sport is how we approach it. Because there's a lot of people who have.
That's really good to point out the idea that that's where we often assume it's going to happen individually, but there is, humanly speaking, probably more accessibility through the smaller groups as opposed to the personal one-to-one, which is super intense when you get to that point of evangelism. Interesting, Beth Harrell, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you're really talking about friends,
Okay.
individual friends, knowing their friends, inviting them to a group activity, so to a small group activity that's a barbecue. And then you're thinking, how does the evangelism actually happen from there? Does it happen because there's someone at that barbecue, maybe the second or third barbecue along after you've come to a few of them, and says, actually, I just want to give a little talk, and there's actually a little talk here when they're at the barbecue? Or is there an invitation from the barbecue to another event at which that will happen? Or does the evangelism then go back down into individuals following up and having those conversations with friends? So the trajectory or the pathway as people move to the right can happen from individual to team and back to individual, from team to individual and back to team. It can happen in a bunch of different ways. But what's encouraging is to hear you talk is that you're thinking about how it might happen, how people could, what's the next step after they come to that barbecue? How are they, if the gospel was kind of alluded to and there was a few stones put in shoes, what's the next step to the right for those people? And in many ways, one of the useful things about this diagram is it helps you think, okay, what is the next step that way for these people? Is it church? Is it a corporate evangelism? Is it a small group? Is it, etc.? Now, where is the point at which they're now going to hear the gospel clearly explained? And you've asked that question. What we find, as I've talked to people in these workshops for the last 10 years, 12 years, very frequently there isn't a next step. It's that we've gathered and engaged is great, and it's almost like we've done the job, we've engaged, but we don't think through what's the next step to the right that contains that proclamation and that word. And that might be different for different people, you're right. For some people it might be better to be a one-to-one conversation. For other people it might be better come to this thing that we're planning, etc. But that you're thinking those things through. What's next for them, that's the really key.
Yeah, a friend of mine always says the only limits on our work on this is faithfulness and creativity. And what you're showing is, yes, be as creative as you can. Build ministry for the people, so to speak. And you have to be faithful. We're not peddlers of the truth. But be within that constraint, be as creative as you can be to engage and then evangelize. Beth, I will finally say why I said your name. Beth Harrell's a women's director here. She also works with Matthias Media. And she runs a group in this room called Good Food. And they get together quarterly, and women read good books and they eat good food together. It's interesting, some of the guys have picked it up, similar to your idea, and said, we need something for the guys like this, but we're two guys, so let's just call it Books and Meat. But what's interesting is that that is an established, right, Beth? That would be an established event. But you have moved it to an engage event and make the meat the draw as opposed to the book. But there would be an interesting way to creatively say, let's get guys together, and maybe subtly over time they come together over meat. And then let's introduce a small talk, a short thing we'll read and talk about. So yeah, really, thank you.
Yeah, it's funny, as Marty and I were talking about this, the things we were going to talk about in this next session, and it's all going to get mixed up. So we're just going to go with it and see what happens. And so whatever we say here, I don't know, I might repeat it later, but whatever. What you're saying is that you'd like to have a step from these casual engagement to evangelism. There's two things that you're going to need. You're going to need to have, if I put it over here, you're going to have to have equipped people over in this part of the diagram with the heart and the knowledge and competency to explain the gospel, step one. Step two, figured out in what way or with what structures or in what kind of manner you're going to deploy those people. If you don't mind me use the word deploy, it sounds a bit managerial, but let's just say deploy those people back here to do the evangelism. Is it that you're going to have individual evangelists who meet with people one-to-one and do the follow-up? Or are you going to have people engaging in a small group style of evangelism where they share the gospel that way? Or even are you going to have some Sunday morning evangelists who hang around at the back, who look for the people who are new, who sit next to the newcomers, so that your newcomer team knows that you're there, those guys are there, and when someone is obviously new, they send them to you, you go and sit next to them and see what sort of conversation emerges. But step one is, do you have the people who are fired up in their hearts for the gospel and have been given some training and competency to know what to say? They really know the gospel and they can express it. That you then are thinking, what's the structure or trellis, small, medium or large, in which they're going to do that work? And what you're expressing is the common problem in many engage to evangelize challenges. That we get the engage going. It's much easier to get an engage event happening. People are happy to do that. Invite your friends, do some meat, do a craft morning, run a, what do you guys call it? We call it a play circle in Australia.
MOPS, yeah.
MOPS, Is that right?
Mothers of preschoolers.
MOPS. Okay, MOPS. I can't do it, sorry, MOPS. You'd run we did that sort of thing in Australia as well. You do a play circle or a MOPS, but then what happens after that? Where do those women, what's the next step for those women? And there's many play circles that have great time, have lots of women, but the next step is vague or not expressed or not clear or not active. And so that you just run MOPS for years and years and years and years, engage over that time hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women, and yet you can look back and say how many people were converted through MOPS. You'd say actually hardly any. Why was that? We didn't preach the gospel. There wasn't a next step into the gospel.
Yeah, go, you done?
I was just going to say, am I done? Yeah. You finish
I don't know why I
yet?
try. Let's
Okay.
keep going, just
Can we go back to me now? Is that what you're saying?
back to you.
And the key difference, I can actually think of 2 play circles in Australia that my wife was involved in, both of them, which were both extremely successful in terms of the number of women and engagement they had with the community. They were superbly run, and women flocked to them. They were fantastic. One of the play circles never saw any fruit, and the other one saw fruit. And the only difference between them was that one circle had 5 women running it, and they ran crazy every Monday morning to make it happen. And the other circle had 9 women, 5 to run like crazy and make it all happen and chop up the fruit and look after everything and read the story and etc. And 4 women whose only job was to talk to and evangelise the mums who were there and invite them to read the Bible. Their structure was, will you read the Bible with me? That was their structure. So their invite, their next step was, are you interested in any of this stuff? Would you like to sit down and read a gospel with me? And those women had been trained to open the Bible and read the gospel with a non-Christian person. They'd done some training, and there was a next step and some people ready to implement that step. And the difference was that all sorts of people strangely got converted in one play circle but not in the other. So just as an illustration of the point we're discussing.
Can I just recommend a book? It's not a Matthias book. It's called Honest Evangelism by Rico Tice. Rico's spoken up at Parkside Conference a number of times, or a couple times at least. And he makes a really good point. The book's really good. It's just honest evangelism, talking about real life evangelism. He makes a good point that we can't dance around, that getting to the gospel of repentance and calling people to give up their sin and put their trust in Christ, you have to cross what he calls the pain threshold or the pain point. And so part of it, we just don't want to avoid the fact that that's going to have to happen. And part of our trellises, this is kind of melding question 2 and 5 together. Part of our trellises is to be together to help one another. As Tony would say one time, we hunt in packs. It's a little bit of a, but yeah, but that we can help each other. And this is, Tony will talk about session 4 about a curriculum we're coming out with about how to share the gospel, is to help one another move past the pain point. And an example of that would be thinking about Sunday mornings when Tony talked about pointing people to Sunday morning, having someone assigned to meet with, say, first-time visitors. Sometimes we kind of think, let's warm them in. We don't want to get too intense right away. We'll get to know them, and then eventually we'll make sure they're a Christian by explaining the gospel. But I've heard other churches just say, listen, you're new here. We want to tell you what we're all about. And here are the key points. We believe Jesus is the risen King, and go on. Because they're already a warm contact, so to speak. Let's get them on right away. And I remember a dear saint, he's passed in Australia, named John Chapman. He's given by Chapo. Very influential for Tony and many. He's like the Billy Graham of Australia. A very big personality. He ran for a time the Office of Evangelism out of the Sydney Diocese. And he'd always say that it was just much easier to get past the pain threshold right away, right up front. So when he'd be on a flight or on a bus, people would say, "Who are you?" "My name's John." And they'd say, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, the Sydney Diocese pays people like me to tell people like you about Jesus." And right away, right through the pain threshold in a kind of a charming, disarming way. But I just want to make the point that sometimes we can't get around that we have to get through the pain threshold with evangelism. And so maybe we structure some things. We can do this together to help one another, pray for one another, encourage one another. Did you talk to your neighbor this week? How did it go? Type things. Yep.
The thing that Marty's talking about was you do some sort of members course or newcomers thing. Most churches have both, or sometimes it's the same thing. In the particular congregation he was talking about, there was a thing for new people. It's just, if you're new here, come along here and you'll learn all about our church, what's going on. So it was very much targeted just at the brand new person, in other words, who's been engaged, and it gets to this point where they could be anybody. They could be a Christian who's coming to join your church. They could be someone who's vaguely Christian. They could be quasi kind of have some background, or they can be completely new. But they've come to you and they've volunteered to walk in your door. You've got permission, right, to say this is what we're about and this is who we are. And you can run a little friendly welcome 2 or 3 week thing that you invite them along, in the course of which you say, this is the gospel we preach here, and is that you? And find out where those people are at and really preach the gospel to them very clearly through that little structure. It's another little Sunday morning related trellis you could use to do the same thing.
So Tony, let me ask you a question as it relates to number 2 in this. A lot of people say that Sunday morning evangelistically focused Sundays don't work, or Billy Graham rallies don't work. So the big group evangelism doesn't happen. We put an X there. The small group, we run Christianity Explored, no non-Christian comes. We only get Christians that come to Christianity Explored or Alpha, and so it actually becomes an established. So we put an X there. That evangelism really only happens individually. Just curious your comments on that.
Yeah. When these different things fail, which they do, so the evangelistic rally, let's have a guest service, or let's have a special mission where we put something on either within one church or 2 churches get together and run a big event where you have the speaker, the old style, tent style evangelism. That doesn't work anymore, or the course doesn't work anymore. Sometimes the structure in a particular place isn't the best structure for who you are and who the people are you're wanting to reach. That's absolutely right. But the really fundamental reason why the structures don't work is because the failure is up the other end of the arrow. Much as we were just saying, it's because we haven't equipped people here to be fired up by the gospel, to bring their friends to the structure and to walk with their friends through that structure and share the gospel with them, or answer their questions, or be with them in that structure. And so the places in Sydney where I am that still will run a big evangelistic meeting, and it works and people become Christians, it's not because it was such a great meeting, or because the speaker was Franklin Graham, or because we got some big guy in, or because whatever. The reason is that the people were already engaging with their friends. They were equipped and excited about one-to-one engaging with their friends, and so they took their friends to the rally, or they take their friends to the Christianity Explored course. And so when people say, Christianity Explored, we tried that, didn't work, you're right. If you just try it, it won't work. You have to think, are my people so fired up and equipped and mature in their love for Christ and others that they are engaging with their friends and that they long for their friends to come to know Jesus? Because the gospel's really clear in their minds, and they're thinking, my friends are in the kingdom and domain of darkness and are going to hell, but Jesus is offering them forgiveness, and to serve him as Lord is the greatest thing ever. And if they're fired up with that knowledge and that conviction, they'll invite their friends to a course. You're making it easy for them. You don't even have to explain the gospel straight away to them personally. Come along to something where we'll help you do that all together. So any structure will fail, any attempt will fail if it isn't populated and energised by people whose hearts have been convicted about the gospel, basically. Practically
speaking, humanly speaking, the best people to gather, to start that movement going, the excitement, are adult converts. Sorry, Mark is the only Presbyterian in the room, I apologize. But it is really true that the adult converts are the ones often who've experienced that change, domain of darkness, kingdom of the Son, and they're the ones who will understand the excitement and to say, come with me. No different than, I just had this great meal at this local restaurant, you got to go. Because they've had that tangible experience. And so those are the people I think to start, not only, but those are the people to start with to try to get them fired up for that work.
Sure, but if your mature Christians are not fired up for that work, they're not mature. Maturity is not, I'm becoming more and older and more settled, and I'm spreading like me, and I'm becoming slower. That's not Christian maturity, although it's physical maturity. It's maturity is a greater and greater love and understanding of God and of Christ, and a greater and greater awareness of the terrible nature of sin and of the horrors of being separated from God. Like, maturity is growth in evangelistic heart, not declension away from evangelistic excitement. All that Muddy is saying is exactly true. Take advantage of those new converts, get them working. They're excited. But if your people aren't excited to share the gospel, there's a maturity issue among your people, which we all have, right? It's a maturity question.
Question number 3, when someone is new from another church or a new Christian, how do you establish that person in the specific content of the gospel? Anyone want to share where and how that happens at your church? Pastor Nick and I just did a Vinegrowers consultation to a church down in North Carolina, and their counseling ministry is actually an engagement ministry. They offer it for free unless you go to church. Because the church people who need counseling, they pay for it. It's interesting, right? It's the reason it's stuck in my mind because it's the opposite of what we think. But they offer it for free, and it's pegged at engagement with the specific, to you guys' point, what you're thinking through, to like, how can the next step be hearing the gospel? Now, that depends on the type of counseling you do, and we didn't get in detail. That will all happen in the same, but take the point still. Again, this is back to only parameters are creativity and faithfulness, right? And so you guys teach the gospel specifically by inviting them into a personal relationship to go through a specific content. There's lots of different ways to do it. It's just a question to keep on the front of your mind. Tony's going to come back to this on the fourth session here just in a bit. Question number 4, how would you, the people you minister to, summarize the driving motivation for them to pursue godliness and Christ-likeness?
So the summary of what we talked about is just teaching that shows Christianity and living for Christ is good, showing the scriptural foundation, lifting up Christ. Holiness is a result of grace, not a way of earning something. The joy of obeying, perseverance until you see Him. The promise of Jesus' rule on earth and making heaven concrete rather than nebulous. Like, this is something we're looking forward to. Those are all.
That's great. I think in in the Old North group, we talked a number of different ways. It was grace, kind of a gratitude thing. It was also just a general sense of oughtness. I'm a Christian, I should do this. Peer pressure, this is what everybody else is living, I should live this way. But I think, again, the challenge from this morning was, are we living this way because Jesus is my Lord and commands me to live this way? And then that kind of goes back to is that the full gospel we're preaching and teaching? Thus the driving motivation. Good? No, hold up. No, just hold it. Just wait. Question 5. I can tell. I know enough. Just wait. All right. Question 5. How many people in the last year have made noticeable steps to the right, such that they are actively ministering back to the left? What trellises help them do this? How many left lookers have welled up from your ministries in the last year? It's whatever you do, whether it's Course Your Life, some curriculum that you guys come up with. It's the idea of really specifically, with clarity, calling people to say, stop being only a consumer Christian. Learn for the sake of others because their life depends upon it. Their life depends upon it.
When we came up with the Course of Your Life idea, the reason for it was that as we looked for simple resources and ways to push people from establishing to equipping, that is, to make that move in their heart and life, to realise, hang on, I'm not just a disciple, I'm a disciple maker, and that's what it means to be a Christian and to have that change of conviction and heart. We looked around and couldn't find any good handy resources to sort of work through with people, to work through that those ideas. And our conviction was, and this is why I just want to come back to the really basic things. Remember, we're saying that what pulls you this way, where is it? What pulls you that way? It is the 4 Ps. It's the word of God, the gospel-focused word of proclamation. And basically all we do in the course of your life is study the Bible. That's all it is. But it's the study of the Bible that's gospel-centered and that focuses on this particular issue. What is my life about? What does it mean to be a disciple? Where does the Bible talk about how the gospel drives me to love others and to share it with others and to minister to others? And so all it is just a framework that does that. If you can figure out your own framework to focus intentionally on those issues in the Word of God around the gospel with people, to push them out of being stuck in establishing to saying, yeah, it's actually my wonderful privilege and joy to minister to other people. Figure out how you're going to get them to make that transition. That's all the course of your life tries to do. Use that by all means, or grab it and get the best ideas out of it and write your own. But that's the thing that it's trying to achieve, and it does achieve. So,
As we finish up here, I just want to make an observation about our church. Pastor Dan here at Old North Church and myself, we're working on our trellis. We are trying to take our small groups and move them more from established to the established equip. What we've realized over the years in God's kindness, we've seen lots of fruit from that. But our trellises have what we've done is we deployed people back to the left, but only to, how I want to say it, mid-establishment. We realized that we've done a decent job of training up small group leaders and had the trellis to deploy them back, probably mid-established. They know how to handle people who've been Christian. Because one, we don't have it until recently had a lot of new Christians. We don't have anybody to deploy them to. And number two, we don't know how to actually handle new Christians, especially ones who have no church background. And so what we're trying to figure out here is how to move people to the equipped stage in their small group training and different things and actually deploy them structurally. What structures or trellises could we figure out to move them back to either very early establish or even back to evangelism? Now, then the question would come up, and I think the Old North gang, they talked about this. Can you actually trellis, create a structure for pushing people back to evangelism? That's harder, right? We can create a small group that does, preaches the word, teaches the word, goes through doctrine, goes through books. But can you actually trellis and to hold people, as I said in the question here, move people back to the left and make sure they go with you? That's a lot harder. Well, and that kind of gets back to Dwayne's question earlier today about door knocking. Is the idea that door knocking could be a really good opportunity to do the equipping, even though humanly speaking, it may not be the most fruitful for actually evangelizing people. I mean, that's in God's kindness that he moves people in. But that we can actually hold people accountable by just saying, come with me. And I'll do it next time you do half of it, next time you do all of it, or however it comes out. And that is the advantage. That's kind of, I think the Australians have always called it cold turkey evangelism. Why do you call it cold turkey evangelism?
I've got no idea. You're just doing it. I mean, cold turkey is what happens when you withdraw from drugs, right? You go into a terrible state of cold turkey. And so why that should be called cold turkey evangelism, I've got no idea.
I've never... because you're British. That's not fair. You're Commonwealthers.
I've got no... I think you just do it cold. You go up to somebody and you just do it cold, and the other cold thing is a cold turkey. I don't know. Maybe that's why. But the idea that... But it's what Matt's saying is interesting. He's got... It's a fairly informal and easy and simple trellis or structure. That is, if you're fired up over here, you've been equipped for evangelism. Okay, how do I now go and do it? You provided a next step back to the left for them to go and do it. Come and do it with me. Now, that's a very, very simple trellis, and it's not that scalable, if I can put it that way. Like, there's only one of you, so you're only going to be able to, maybe you might get more who can do it, but that's one way to do it. The other most common one back in the small group space, the other kind of evangelistic trellis there, is some form of group study or course or event that takes place over a period of 3 or 4 weeks. Christianity Explored is one classic. It takes place over, I think, 7 weeks. There's a bunch of different ones that do it. Back in my part of the world, this is the most common evangelistic trellis now. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 week ones, there are 7-week ones. There are ones that you just invite people to 1 week. Just come tonight and see what you think. And if you're liking what you're hearing and you're enjoying this and you'd like to take the conversation further, come next week. Sometimes it's as simple as that. And those small evangelistic trellises, they, as I sort of said before, you can try them and say that they don't work, but they won't work because you haven't done the work up this end to teach and equip and encourage and build up a level of heat and enthusiasm among your people for evangelism. If you build that up and train and then you say, here's the structure we're going to use together, let's go for it, that structure can work extremely well. But if you just put on the structure and you haven't done that other work, it probably won't.
Can I just finish on it? I want to push into that just a bit in our last 3 minutes before our break. Just curious, anybody run a small group evangelistic focused something?
Trellis.
Does anybody run that on a regular basis? Not one group. Yeah, again, Commonwealther. Would you run Christianity Explored?
Christianity Explored.
Okay. How does it go for you?
Varying success. We have,
Do you run it in your church building?
not anymore, we used to.
Where do you run it?
We moved buildings, so we've not run it since we moved.
Okay. All right, so we have one church. No one else does anything small group oriented. I know enough about the context in Sydney to know that it actually is pretty well, a lot of people run small group evangelistic courses there. Now, our kind of natural response is like, oh, that's just cultural context. It's different. But I don't think I'm really ready to toss it out yet. Can you say, Tony, what could be helpful for us to know to say, don't give up trying? Not because it's the sacred, it has to happen this way. But it seems to me like in a whole room like this, we're not doing anything like that. It seems like an obvious, like, let's rethink this. Why is it that it seems to work down there? You've already mentioned one. You're doing equipping on the right side. Anything else?
Yeah. One of the reasons that it's thrived where we are is that church-based evangelism, there's not a steady stream of nominal or non-Christian people turning up into our churches in Sydney in a way that many of you guys will still find is happening. You'll be running churches where some of the members have been there for 30 years and they're not Christians. Or you've got, well, they wouldn't be members, obviously, would they, if you're a good Baptist church? But anyway, we won't go into that. There's people sitting there for lots of reasons in your church, okay? And you have newcomers and people who just come to church. It's more of a church-going culture in Midwestern United States, if I can put it that way, in a way that's not the case in Sydney. We're more like Seattle or Providence, Rhode Island or something, very post Christian. And so people don't just come to church unless someone invites them, unless a keen friend says, I just love this so much, you must come along, it's fantastic, and we hear this great stuff, you should come. And they come. But that's kind of rarer, and in Sydney, in our culture, that's a big step. If you're non-churched, if there's no church culture, and the first thing you're asked to go to is church, it's a big cultural step into this strange environment. Whereas if a group of 10 of us are getting together and we're going to meet at Bill's place and we're going to talk about what Christianity really is, I think you're interested in finding out what it is. Let's go and have dinner there and talk about it. That's a simpler cultural step to make for many of our folks. So if you've got a heart for the gospel, you've been trained, you've been equipped, there's something to invite your non-Christian friend to, it's actually an easier invitation than the invitation to church for many of our people. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the case for you guys. I suspect it will increasingly be the case in your culture, as your culture... There's very few things in which Australia leads the world or leads the United States. This is one of those very rare occasions. We're further down the road to paganism than you are. But you're catching up fast. And
Thank you.
So keep at it. Because... yeah, increasingly I think you'll find an invitation to a small group event to explain the gospel is going to be an easy invitation for your people to make.
And this is where I'm looking out, and Haley and Evangel and Bruce with our church and Kyle, like campus ministry is so strategic for this. And then what Matt and Chris and you guys are doing downtown, like doing this kind of work where there are non-Christians clearly in front of you is a great training ground. So I encourage you to talk to any of these people and get some more ideas. We're going to take a break right now. We still have out there, hang in there, we got one more session. Tony's going to talk What are you going to talk about?
Something wrong.
Yeah. What's your sheet say?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about gospel clarity again and
Yeah.
where this gospel clarity kind of happens in our church lives and in this framework, and how we can start to increase and get it to happen. So.